My name is Lindsay Giese. I'm the Executive Director for River Arts, Inc., and we are very excited to have this lecture film series. Even though it has to be virtual, it still will be a lot of fun. The lecture series came about because this is actually the 20th anniversary of the River Arts Center's programming, and Kurt can go into detail more later if we have time, but these lectures were a part of the first season. Actually, the very first event that was on the River Arts Center stage was a lecture about Badger. So we are just thrilled to be doing this tonight. Last major thing before we really get going is that I wanted to thank our donors this evening. We are able to host this lecture series, which is a 3-part lecture series. So there's 2 more coming up, thanks to a grant from the Community Foundation of South Central Wisconsin and a gift from Craig Culver. So we do want to thank those donors. I'm going to first introduce one of our guests, and he will introduce our other guests. And I'm going to start with his bio. It is profound, and I didn't memorize it, so I will read it to you if you bear with me. And I'm only going to read a paragraph of it because it's like many pages long. Dr. Kurt Meiney is a conservation biologist, historian, and writer. He serves as a senior fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation in Baraboo, Wisconsin, and with the Chicago-based Center for Humans and Nature. He is a research associate with the International Crane Foundation, also located in Baraboo, associate adjunct professor in the University of Wisconsin-Madison Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology. I have known Kurt since the very beginning of working here at River Arts Inc. in 2012, because we have his books available here. And he is such a delight and is always introducing me to lovely people. I'm sure that he introduced me to our guests today, actually. So without further ado, please welcome virtually, Dr. Kurt Meiney.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Lindsay. And thank you to the River Arts Center for hosting this wonderful event, which we planned long before we all knew we were going to have to do it this way. But we adapt and we go forward. So I'm coming to you from my place down west of Sauk, Prairie, along the Wisconsin River off Highway 60. If I freeze up on my internet feed here, it's because that occasionally happens. I tend to unfreeze in about 3 or 4 seconds, so I won't be away for too long. I'm going to keep my remarks real short here because mostly we want to watch the 2 films that we have produced at the Alliance. But this is also a really great opportunity for a couple of reasons. One, again, to already Lindsay mentioned that going all the way back to the origins of the River Arts Center, the Alliance, the Sauk Prairie Conservation Alliance and River Arts have kind of danced over the last 20 years, and this is just the latest round, so it's wonderful. Second, it's a great opportunity to remember, then you'll see this in the film, that it was almost years ago that the reuse plan.
It happens, Kurt. We lost Kurt for a second here.
Am I back?
Back.
Okay. Very quickly then, 20 years ago, Badger reuse plan was completed, and I saw Rick Walgenbach's name among those who are participating tonight. Rick was also on the reuse committee with me. But it's also a special event because we get to welcome Rebecca as the new director of the Sauk Prairie Conservation Alliance. I call her Becca. She was a former student of mine, actually, way back, not too long ago. But we had lost touch sort of over the years, but I'm delighted that we're back able to be in touch. So I'm going to take this moment just to introduce you all and allow Becca to introduce herself to all of you, especially who live in the Sauk County, Sauk Prairie area. And welcome, Rebecca, to the Alliance and to the community. And we so look forward to a wonderful long partnership with you in this phase of your career. So if you would like to say a few words on behalf of the Alliance.
Sure. Well, first, hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. It was really exciting to see so many members signed up on the list. And this is really the first time I'm getting a chance to talk to you, although I still can't see your faces. But I just wanted to say give a little bit of an introduction to myself and thank you for coming. But I've been working in conservation for over 25 years now, focusing on restoration ecology, land protection, environmental science, and citizen science, volunteers working towards land, environmental protection. And it's really the best work there is, I think, and I'm really excited to be a part of the Alliance and to be part of its next phase moving forward. And I feel so lucky tonight that we have two of our experts, the most experts of the Alliance joining us, who can answer your questions, because I'm still learning a lot. So, but these fellows can answer all your questions, as can many of you, I'm sure, because many of our members, of course, have been involved a lot longer than I have. So anyways, I just want to say good evening and thanks for joining us, and I'll pass the baton now.
Great. Well, thank you, Becca. Don't worry, you'll be filled up with Badger facts before you know it, and sharing them as easily as we all do. So it's also a special occasion and opportunity to have Charlie, because this is a chance, sort of in a public way, to thank Charlie for his years of service, which actually go way back, and you'll learn a little bit about that in the film. But for the last, what was it, Charlie, 4 years, 5 years?
5 years.
5 years, taking over the Sauk Prairie Conservation Alliance and allowing us to do so many wonderful things. And I'll cut it. I won't say much about that because we've got to get to the film. But Charlie, I do want to take the moment just to say again in a public way, thanks for all of your hard work for so long on behalf of the Alliance and for the community, and for working with Becca to pass the baton. So it's just been a great gift to have Charlie and Becca providing the leadership for the Alliance. So we're going to let Charlie say a few words specifically about how the film you're going to watch came about. But anything else you'd like to add, Charlie? We're just, we got about 2 or 3 minutes, just if we want to keep on schedule.
Great, thanks, Kurt. I sure appreciate the warm welcome, and it was good to see a lot of familiar names on the list of participants tonight. Hello to friends and colleagues from these many years. And I'm glad to be here to kind of hand off the baton to Becca. This is, it's great to have Becca join us, and I'm sure she's going to do a great job with the Alliance. You folks are about to see, if you haven't seen it already, a 30-minute documentary that was put together in 2018 to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Sauk Prairie Conservation Alliance. And we updated the video at the end of 2019 to include the newly constructed Great Sauk Trail. So we have several new segments in the updated version. Some of you came to our 20th anniversary event in 2018 and saw the prototype. Now we have our final version out there. And if for some reason you get cut off tonight or want to see it, you can go to the Alliance's website. What you are about to see is the personal perspective shared through 18 different individuals that had and played diverse roles in the formation of the original vision for the former Badger Army Ammunition Plant. These folks will tell their story, their perspective, and by doing so, you'll see the integrated effort that was accomplished by countless individuals promoting a common vision for a green space out at the Badgerlands. And now we can celebrate that success. We have 7,400 acres of new green space, almost half of which is open to the public. So I'm going to cut it off there, because otherwise the time police will come along here, and I'll say enjoy the show. If you have questions, as Lindsay mentioned, feel free to type in the chat, and Kurt and I and Becca, to the degree we can, will answer your questions at the end of the show. We've allowed, 10 or 15 minutes, I think, at the end of the showing of the video. So enjoy the film, folks, and we'll be back in touch shortly.
The story of the Sauk Prairie and the former Badger Army ammunition plant is one of a community coming together, seeking common ground, trying to do right by the land, its people, its history, and its future. It's a story full of twists and turns, comedy and tragedy, setbacks and breakthroughs. It's the story of citizens discovering their connection to this place and to each other. It's the story of so many people trying to work for positive change and finding themselves changed in the process. And it's a story that continues to unfold every day. Like so many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, you drive by on Highway 12 and look off to the east and you'd see this strange landscape, these old buildings and this factory out in the middle of cornfields. And it was a mystery, as it was for so many others.
What we have here is the opportunity of 100 lifetimes. Together we have the chance to reach out and touch the future in a way that few people ever can. If you think about our national park system and the people who set that up for us, those people are long gone, but we still have the gift of those parks today. That's the kind of opportunity we have here at Badger, because this is unique. It's the largest portion of undeveloped land still remaining in southern Wisconsin.
I think if you care about the land, you are a conservationist. And often we conservationists find ourselves in the position of fighting against negative trends and impacts on the land. But at Badger, the conservation community saw a rare and important chance to come together and to work toward a positive vision, to turn a place with a long history of loss, pain, and degradation into a place of renewal, beauty, and reconciliation. A first meeting, and it was in December of 1997, up at the International Crane Foundation near Baraboo. And many of us work in conservation all over the state of Wisconsin, around the country, even internationally. And here was an opportunity to think about applying those same ideas and skills and relationships to a piece of our own landscape here at home. So after that first meeting, I stepped up to be the volunteer chair of this new coalition. One of the very first calls that I made, in fact, was to the HoChunk Nation. The HoChunk Nation, whose ancestral territory we are in here, who had a strong interest in the future of the Badger Army ammunition plant. And it was really important to start that conversation, to understand how the HoChunk viewed this piece of property and what their interests were. Good
afternoon. My name is John Greendeer. They call me Mashuska, or White Feather, where I'm from. I'm a member of the HoChunk Nation and a member of the Deer Clan. Today I was asked to share a little bit about a place that we call Mawakachunk, or the sacred earth, the sacred land. And on the other side, Dewakachunk, they would call the sacred lake or spirit lake. We've come to discover how important that this piece of land, which the old ones we'll call the flats, served as our epicenter in a lot of places where, you know, if you take a look at our communities in La Crosse, in Madison, in Wisconsin Dells, and Baraboo, and Tomah, this was a thoroughfare through our state for HoChunks to settle. 4 main villages within the 20 miles, a number of effigy mounds just within walking distance from where we are today, medicines that only grew in this area, plants, wildlife, habitat, number of homes that lived, that were dwellings that were on the side of these bluffs that they used for protection from the weather, or on the south side to gain as much of the warmth as we could.
The idea of prairie restoration at Badger is not new. In the late 1970s, Dave Fordham, the commander's representative at Badger, essentially the plant manager, often volunteered to collect prairie seeds for the nearby International Crane Foundation and the Aldo Leopold Foundation. In return, Badger was provided a share of the seed collected, and Dave Fordham facilitated prairie plantings along Highway 12 outside of the Badger fence.
Dave Fordham identified parts of the plant where prairie restoration and prairie planting could occur. He also allowed for great things like bird surveys and wildlife surveys.
Dave and I are skiing out at Devil's Lake, and he says, "Charlie, I want to share with you a dream. There's a lot of badger that's not being used for anything, and I would like to restore that back to some native habitat like prairie." That was the winter of '96. What came out of that is a group that we called the Sauk Prairie Restoration Council, SPARC, S-P-R-C. And over the course of the next 2 years, I facilitated a process to create what was called the Preliminary Restoration Plan for 1,300 acres of the badger plant.
In 1997, as discussions about the future of the soon-to-be decommissioned Badger ammunition property began, Mary Yackel and Virginia Metcalf, our two prairie godmothers, gave life to the vision being developed by the conservation community. They determined that the vision must somehow be depicted visually to get the message across to the community.
The role of the Sauk Prairie Conservation Alliance has changed considerably in its 20-year history. It started out obviously promoting an idea, a vision.
Mary and Virginia had the vision, and they translated that vision into a painting, which they commissioned from Victor Botkin, a fine painter who was at that point working for the Crane Foundation. He'd made a massive painting, which they called Sauk Prairie Remembered, A Vision for the Future.
It was a visual depiction of the landscape that we were envisioning for the future. And so we stood behind that vision, that image, that iconic painting, as what we wanted to do out here at Badger, restore a lot of the landscape to some of its original native habitat.
We admired these two women who so diligently hauled this gigantic painting all over southern Wisconsin. And when we asked them how they had the stamina to keep doing it, they said, "Oh, we let George do it." George was their truck. Mary and Virginia were founding members of the Alliance, and they kept saying, "Imagine, just imagine." We thank them.
The landscape of the Badger Army Ammunition Plant has obviously changed dramatically over the last 200 years. And as much as we may try, we cannot return it to that ecological condition. But what we can do, and have work to do, is to begin the process of healing, to reclaim some of the land's native diversity and ecological functioning, and just as important, to bring people together in the process.
So we're in Sumter, and in the back row is one of the old guys who lives around here. So all this talk is going on and on about Badger and its future and what's going on and things like that. So he doesn't raise his hand, but he very gently raises his voice and says, "We had a paradise here, and they took it away from us."
In 1942, the U.S. Army condemned over 10,000 acres of land owned and lived on by some 80 farm families on the Sauk Prairie in order to construct the Badger Ordnance Works, later renamed Badger Army Ammunition Plant. The farmers, many of them with roots here going back for generations, were given less than 3 months to leave their farms, pack or sell all of their possessions, and find a new life for themselves and their families somewhere else. This was devastating for many of those families, and the impact, the deep loss and anger were felt for generations.
It affected both my grandmother and my grandfather, I think, somewhat differently, and losing the land. Both of them lost this dream house of their own that they had built with their own lumber in their own hands, and that was something I think they missed the rest of their lives. My grandfather, to him, it was more a loss of, he was a farmer, and this was his land that was taken away from him, and he never really got over that. I can remember as a teenager asking him why he didn't go to church, and he said, if there was a God, this would have never happened to me. And that was a strong statement for him. I mean, he never was really bitter, but that kind of told you how deeply hurt he was. For Grandma, it was much more a social thing. She missed her friends. She really, really missed the deep relationship she had with her church and with her friends that she'd grown up with on the prairie. My grandparents chose to be buried back over here, so they're buried in the cemetery on the corner of County Road Z and Highway 12, just south of the plant here.
There were lots of folks who came forward with plans for Badger. There were all kinds of proposals for a prison or a racetrack or all kinds of different ideas, reindustrializing the plant. But there was no process to help work through this. Our congressman at that time who started a process to try to solve this, but it wasn't given enough time. In my memory, I think it was originally 4 weeks or 5 weeks, and you cannot solve a complex issue like this in that short a time.
During the Klug Commission, we'd meet at Spruce Street School, and we'd talk about what we'd heard and what we liked and what we didn't like, and there was a whole lot we didn't like. We wanted to keep the industries that were developed in the communities and not have them rivaled with businesses that were developing in the Badger plant. And we also knew that if they put industry into the Badger plant, they weren't going to clean it up. So we wanted the land cleaned up.
And it was shortly after that that this loose coalition came together that we called the Community Conservation Coalition for the Sauk Prairie. This was not going to be something that people in positions of influence or authority in the state government or the federal government were going to tell us what to do. It's one that we in this community were going to generate ourselves from the bottom up.
When I was first elected to the House of Representatives, there was a lot of controversy around the future use of Badger Army Ammunition Plant. I was so pleased to be able to secure funding for a facilitated consensus process, brought all the stakeholders that we possibly could to the table, and that resulted in a vision that I think the community really embraced, that did open up the land for public use, regrowth of the prairies, foraging activities and research, things that we can prize for a long, long time to come.
A friend of mine once put it this way: we used to say it's all about the land, but it's not. It's all about the people. It would always come down to personal relationships and trying to get folks to work together. And that's been so much of our work, listening, exchanging ideas and information, exploring our shared aims, with a faith that with some creativity and flexibility, we could all work together in the same place.
The Badger Reuse Plan was signed in March 2001 by the 21 participating stakeholders. The plan provided a blueprint for Badger's future green vision. Participants included Kurt Miney, representing the coalition, future Alliance President Dave Tremble, working for Sauk County, as well as Alliance members Mike Mossman, who represented the Badger History Group, Mike Dagan, who served as the DNR Secretary's representative, and Sauk County Board member Bill Wenzel. All contributed significantly to this groundbreaking document. The reuse plan set the stage for the eventual land transfers and cleanup.
So when Badger became available, the issue was, if I want a piece of the property, the best way to have a chance at it was to find a federal sponsor for my project. So we had initially interest from the HoChunk through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the federal agency, the DNR as an entity working with the Park Service, and then of course the Dairy Forage Research Center, which is part of the Department of Agriculture. So they already had essentially first dibs because they were already here and they were already a federal entity.
But to me, the most important value, and the one that really captures to me what Badger is all about, is one that came out of a statement by my friend Mike Mossman. He says, you know, let's try to turn the page here. Maybe the future uses of Badger can help us achieve reconciliation. And as soon as he said that word, I just felt something very powerful come forward. And in fact, when you read the Badger Reuse Plan there, it's in the plan. It's one of the core values of this vision. The future uses of the Badger Army Ammunition Plant shall contribute to the reconciliation of past conflicts.
Most all of us felt the same way in the area here, that what should have done is the families owned the ground should have been given a chance to buy back. And as I understand it, the original contract said they would be able to, but Congress had made some ruling in the meantime that they couldn't do that anymore. I mean, not all farmers would want their land back. I mean, that was up there where the main manufacturing was. That's so ruined. I mean, what's it good for, really? As far as the prairie restoration, I mean, where they got some of the prairie over on the northeast side, that's a good place for it. We've worked land over there. That land is stony and it's not nice farmland. We were very happy that Dairy Forage Research Center got to go to Agrilands.
We wanted the land to bloom again, for it to come to its full potential, and also for the human community itself to be healed and bloom again. What could be a less peaceful place than a factory that is building ammunition to be blown up someplace, to kill people, to destroy things? Mennonites have a hard time with that, of course. To take a piece of land used for those purposes and move it all the way back to nature, the symbolism of that is emotionally very strong, theologically very strong. And that's one of the primary reasons that members of our church have supported the Alliance in its work.
The healing of the land is really important. It's important to see that what the use was of this property before, and at one time we all understand what the Badger ammunition plant was doing. There's a lot that needs to be changed, and these are the efforts that we want to continue to share, that it is happening, that healing is happening, that restoration is there.
The folks that came to the meetings often were the same folks, and that usually included members of the Alliance, Citizens for Safe Water Around Badger, Badger History Group, the three notable groups. And one of the things I have to say is that I believe success is 99% showing up. And I have to say that the folks on the Sauk Prairie Alliance had that stick-to-itiveness because they were always there. And that really contributed to keeping the focus on the prairie restoration and the cooperative working arrangements at the forefront of the discussions.
At the same time that the land transfer was happening, we saw the deconstruction of 1,400 buildings, the removal of infrastructure, and the beginning of addressing the contaminated soil and water. It could not have been achieved without the advocacy of groups like CSWAB, making sure that there was safe drinking water in the vicinity of the Badger Army ammunition plant. And advocacy organizations like the Sauk Prairie Conservation Alliance is indispensable.
To their credit, the Army stepped up, and I think we can credit Joan Kenny and Mike Sitton and the local representatives of the Army for this forward thinking, that they developed this new technique that they called wet demolition. And what that involved was essentially saturating the building with water as they systematically disassembled those buildings. And it led to the ultimate removal of nearly all 1,400 of those buildings and paved the way for transfer of the property to the state of Wisconsin and the other owners.
There had never before in U.S. history been a transfer of land from the Army to a tribal nation. And I had worked on this for literally almost 2 decades. And indeed, with the passage of the National Defense Authorization Act, we secured that land transfer finally and celebrated it quite recently.
Senator Baldwin really put her efforts where her words were and eventually worked with the National Defense Authorization Act and included language that not only returned all 1,553 acres back to the HoChunk Nation, but 2 more additional things. That all of it would return to the HoChunk Nation in trust status, which means it is in full jurisdiction of the HoChunk Nation. It is ours, we own it. The next thing that Tammy Baldwin did was include a polluter pay provision in there, which means that any hazard mitigation and any remediation is on the federal government side, not ours. And so With the passage of the Defense Authorization Act comes a phone call from Senator Baldwin's office to my office and said, we did it. We got this land back.
Now that we have a future where we do have more than one landowner out here, it's thinking about how all of those landowners can work together across property boundaries to achieve common goals and to bring the public into that process so that they feel and can better understand sort of what our connection is as community members to this landscape.
During the time that I was president, one of our primary functions at that time in the Alliance was to have educational events for school children. To see a big yellow school bus pull up at the plant and a bunch of enthusiastic kids roll out of the door, that was, I think that was one of the more positive things that we were able to accomplish through the years.
We're committed to following the reuse ordinance. So these are things that, if that did not exist, this would not be HoChunk property here today.
What Badger represents is an opportunity to think about multifunctional landscapes. So how can we do a better job of thinking about land as a place where you can produce food, you can restore wildlife habitat, you can create places where we can have groundwater recharge, carbon sequestration, trails for people to recreate. You can also explore our human history, so through all sorts of different perspectives of the different people who've lived here over time.
Eventually, something is going to be on this property to be a learning center, a place where people could find some serenity and understand the history. We have to explore certain items of reintroduction of species of plants, making sure that we have plans to mitigate any types of invasive species that could depreciate some of the value of the land, making sure that we maintain and protect the habitat of birds, migratory birds or nesting birds, and deer.
In my role as a wildlife biologist, I conducted breeding bird surveys at Badger in 1998 and documented how extremely important this landscape was to many rare grassland birds. This and my subsequent surveys led to the proclamation of Badger as a Wisconsin Important Bird Area.
It's connected to the land around it. What happens to the land around it makes a difference to what happens on that piece of land. And wildlife that uses the adjacent landscape can also use badger and vice versa. And it makes for a more viable population of animals and plants. Peregrine falcon also wouldn't be there if it weren't for Devil's Lake, real nearby, where the cliffs occur where the peregrine nests. So it nests on the bluffs at Devil's Lake. It comes down to badger to feed. It needs that large landscape. And that's the same with many other species. So badger is not just an island.
Another part of the planning process that was really an important goal was to connect Devil's Lake with Lake Wisconsin. And if we were to look at the map now, you could see we did just that. It's been exciting to work with our community to bring this trail to life. This has been a trail that's been a dream for over 30 years, but finally the pieces fell in place so that we could build the Great Sauk State Trail and connect the Wisconsin River and Sauk Prairie up to the bluffs of the Baraboo Hills and into Devil's Lake State Park. Our goal long-term is to connect all the way to the Reedsburg Trail, the 400 State Trail, which will allow us to bike or walk all the way to the Mississippi River. And then to continue our work across the Wisconsin River into Dane County, so someday you could bike or walk from the Mississippi River all the way to the Wisconsin State Capitol in Madison. One of the reasons we're excited about the Sauk Prairie Rec area and its connection to the Great Sauk State Trail is that it provides a destination. That if you're starting to bike in Sauk Prairie and you head north now into this beautiful prairie, there are trails and spaces here that you can experience that you can't experience in town. One of the things that was very important to us as we designed the amenities of the Great Sauk State Trail was making sure that there were landmarks along the way that could teach people on the trail. You can stop at these historical markers or cultural markers to read what was happening on this land, the incredible journey that this piece of land in the Sauk Prairie Recreation Area has taken over time. And so we've partnered with artists from throughout the state to put some incredible art pieces along the trail.
Can you imagine the kind of economic development, the kind of opportunity, the kind of understanding that people would have of this beautiful area, going through the Driftless area, going on the Wisconsin River, going through Badger Ordnance, where they made ammunition
for the Vietnam, World War II, and the Korean War, right here. And now we're bicycling through it. The history, the conservation, the opportunities, economic development that can take place.
This trail has been a true collaboration. One of the key elements was the state asking the county to be the lead partner in the development of this trail. We've worked with Dairy Forage. We've worked with the HoChunk Nation. The HoChunk Nation stepped up and helped financially make Segment 2, or what we're standing on today, running through the Sauk Prairie Rec area, a reality.
Part of the investment with the Great Sauk State Trail was to ensure that the HoChunk Nation is able to tell its story and share its culture and share how important the land is to tribal members and to the nation itself. These interpretive panels were done specifically through HoChunk Nation input to ensure that we're telling our stories to ourselves and what we believe is true and how important this land is to us. And hopefully it'll also share a lot with other people who can use the trail and understand how important land is to all of us and that it is connected in so many ways in our daily lives and what we do and who we are. What we're really excited about as well is this continued partnership with the Sauk Prairie Conservation Alliance and everything they've done in partnerships with the HoChunk Nation. There's some really beautiful, exciting things coming. It's going to be a bomb of wildflowers out here. That's going to be an explosion of beauty along the trail that people are going to be able to see.
We have 7,400 acres of protected, mostly public land. We have HoChunk Nation owns 1,550 acres. Dairy Forage owns over 2,000 acres. And the state, we as citizens of Wisconsin own 3,400 acres out here. This is our public land.
One of my roles has been to sit on the ground and pull up garlic mustard, which I'm really good at. And another has been, I believe, to speak for the voiceless, to speak for the land, to speak for the plants and the animals, their hopes and their future. Because every spring, the meadowlarks come back and they plan to make a nest and raise a family and have a fine summer.
One thing that has kept many people going, including me, is to be around other folks who have a similar vision for what could be here. It's a community vision.
I think that this is really truly a national precedent in the decommissioning of a military facility that contained 1,400 buildings, more than 100 miles of roads, dozens of miles of railway, and to envision that this could be a green landscape at some point in time. A lot of people embraced that vision, supported that vision, and that's what we've got now. The buildings have been destroyed, the roads will be removed, trails will take their place, wildlife will prosper, and this is our vision for the future.
They've never taken their eye off of what the community came together to aspire to, and now it's really happening. And I just feel so grateful because none of this can be done by single individuals. This is something that required teamwork.
The Alliance has been conducting volunteer restoration days, educational tours, and programs at Badger for decades.
Our goal is to continue to engage the community in the future conservation and care of the Badgerlands for generations to come. Do you share our vision? We're a member-based organization, and we would welcome your input and your support. New members are always welcome. Be a part of this conservation dream that is now becoming a reality.
At this time, we are welcoming discussion after that wonderful video, and you are welcome to ask Becca, Kurt, Charlie, or all of them. So if you have any questions, please write those in the chat box at this time.
You have to let me show myself again here, Lindsay.
Gotcha.
There we go. Hey, can I just a quick word as we're waiting for questions to come in? I wanted to mention a couple things. One, at the end there, you saw some of the credits, and there was a note about how Sauk County has helped support this through the extension service and through other funding. So just a shout out to Sauk County, for those especially who are citizens of Sauk County. This film was made possible by, in part, your support, you know, that sort of thing. The other thing I want to mention was, I know in looking over the list of names of folks who are on the call tonight, there are a lot of fresh faces, and this may be new to you. There are also a lot of veterans and old friends, and it did occur to me while watching the film this time that there are several faces of people who are no longer with us. And so to mention just ones that caught my eye: Dave Fordham, Mary Yakel, Tom Arbogast, I saw his name in there, or his face, and Gene Robkin, but especially our friend Dave Trumbull. Many of you probably on the call knew and remember Dave, who passed away just last year. And so we never had a chance to have a proper gathering to memorialize Dave, who played such a key role in all of this. And so for those of you who are on the call who remember Dave, let's take a moment just to remember him and all those who we haven't had a chance to really, frankly, show our respects to. So that just occurred to me while I was watching.
And Kurt, I'll add to that, that the production was by Drop Frame out of Prairie to Sauk. Kurt Wenger and Jeff Elsifer did a magnificent job. Originally, this was intended to be about a 5 to 7 minute summary history of the organization, and you can see it turned out to be a 30-minute documentary. So it was quite an effort. And our gratitude is to Kurt and Jeff. They invested a lot of time. A lot of it was pro bono. We paid them some, but not nearly what they were worth for the production of that. So if you know Kurt and Jeff from the area, say thanks to them for this nice production.
Yes, so it looks like we do have our first question from Carol May. She wants to know, what can the average citizen do to assist with this project?
Well, I think that's Becca's call, but Becca, I'm going to cue you up by saying I also noticed in watching it this time how many smiling volunteers there were. So what do you think, Becca? How can people help out?
Yeah, so this year is going to continue to be a little bit strange and different, I think, because of COVID, unfortunately, but there are several ways. One is with your labor, and right now that isn't possible. The DNR is not allowing volunteers out on the land. So we can't do that right now, but we will. You know, that isn't over. It's just on hold. So there are opportunities to remove invasive species, which you heard a little bit about in the film. Mimi talked about pulling garlic mustard, or to collect seed, which is really fun. To collect native species, prairie species seeds is one of my favorite restoration activities. There may be some opportunities to help do some plantings. These are all things that will be somewhat dependent on how this year goes. But we are always looking for volunteers to do all kinds of things. We could use a webmaster. So anyways, if you have, or if there are people who would like to write different things for us, newspaper or newsletter articles, really, if you have a skill that you would like to share, just write me an email and I'll come up with a way you can use it, and that will help our mission. So we love volunteers. That would be great. But really, I'm really just starting to formulate myself how we're going to be moving forward. So there will be more. And then, of course, financial help is always welcome. Just to add that little pitch in there in the end. So yeah, but if you're interested in volunteering, just send me an email and we'll figure out how you can best help us.
Jerry,
And Becca, how can they find your email address?
The email address, I think, is still under Charlie's name, but it is my email address now. So it's saukprairieconservation@gmail.com. And I can put that in the chat real quick.
that would be great. It looks like Charlie already answered this in the chat, but if you're not following the chat, Jerry asked if all the site cleanup, like removal of buildings, infrastructure, et cetera, and soil remediation work has been completed. Charlie, do you want to repeat what you answered?
Yes, there are only a handful of buildings remaining on the property. In fact, some of us that were a little bit interested in historic preservation had hoped that more buildings would have been preserved, but really there are very, very few remaining. The soil has been decontaminated, mediated or remediated, and there is still groundwater contamination that has been persistent for decades, and there's always talk about what to do, but there hasn't been a thorough cleanup yet.
I had a question actually for all of you, and I wondered, the work began over 20 years ago now with the Badger Reuse Plan. Are you pleased with where things are at today, or how are you feeling about how things are in 2021?
Oh boy, well, I was on the reuse committee, and I know, again, I think Rick Walkenbach may be even on the call or on the Zoom here tonight, and I don't know if any other members of the committee. The answer I give to that often when I'm asked is, if you had told me 20 years ago, if you had described to me what Badger is like now 20 years ago and said that's where we'll be in 20 years ago, I would have been extraordinarily amazed and pleased. You know, there was those of you who are old timers will remember how much confusion and doubt and controversy and just skepticism there was. And it's a real testament to the Sauk County and Sauk Prairie community, as well as many others, that we were able to, you know, define a vision, not our vision. And I'm quick to say that it's not the Alliance's vision. It never was. It was us working together and talking and helping coordinate a little bit, but it was a shared community vision. And by golly, you know, as Charlie sometimes will say, we won. We sometimes forget because there have been frustrations along the way. There are things that we're not entirely pleased about as things have gone along, but in the grand scheme of things, those tend to pale before the amazing achievement of being able to say that the Badger lands are now this amazing asset in this community and this amazing ecological social opportunity.
And I would add to that, it really is astonishing. In fact, there were naysayers that said, you've got all of this infrastructure, how could you possibly create a green space with all of these roads and all of these buildings, and yet go out there? You're going to have a hard time seeing much of any of the infrastructure. You'll still see the scars of old roads and the gravel foundations of what once were paved roads, but nature is taking its course and reclaiming the place very, very quickly. So it's pretty astonishing to see that.
Yeah, and it continues. What's fascinating too is, you know, that was the vision 20 years ago, but it continues to evolve and grow in interesting, surprising new ways. And I'm thinking right now of the HoChunk Nation, and especially what happened this last summer, even under COVID circumstances, a really important moment. I'm looking at Lindsay now because I want to bring you into this, that an amazing piece of work done by HoChunk families and artists is now installed along the Sauk Trail, the Earth, Sky, Water installation. And Lindsay had a role to play in that. So we're going to make her part of this panel by asking you to say just a word or two, maybe, Lindsay, about what you, because I know that there, thank you for showing that.
Becca was ready.
But say a few words, Lindsay, from your perspective on that project as an expression of something new and exciting that we didn't predict 20 years ago.
Oh my goodness. Well, it was wonderful. Thank you for bringing that up. And if you haven't been out there, it is right in the thick of the Badgerlands, towards the northern section, but well worth the trip on whether you're walking or biking to journey up there. It originally was a part of the HoChunk Nation made a donation to the trail so that the trail could be built. And so then I stepped in through River Arts Inc. to work with HoChunk representatives and to find an artist that could create something beautiful that tells the story of the land and the people. And what came out of it was surpassed anything that I could expect. We ended up working with Melanie Talmadge-Sains, who is a phenomenal artist. She's with Little Eagle Arts Foundation, LEAF for short. And we had everything set to go, and the pandemic hit, and she adapted and changed the sculpture, worked with HoChunk families, 5 different HoChunk families, to create these little mosaic tiles. And then other organic things happened where we were walking on the trail and we found an old concrete structure that maybe housed tanks back when it was used for the ammunition plant. And we were just, all of these wonderful things just happened where we could connect the past with the present, both the people and the land. And it was an experience that was like no other.
And these are the stories that keep us all going, because it's the continual surprising nature of Badger and what it brings out of us that is unpredictable and exciting and always interesting. So
yeah. Carol May asked if there's a Badger Museum plant or Badger Museum on site, and there is. It is right off of Highway 12, just past Dr. Evermore and Delaney's, but before Sky High. You can't miss it. And we actually will be having a presentation with Verlin as part of this 3-part series in February. So we don't have the sign up link out for that yet, but that will be coming out shortly. So if you want more information about the Badgerlands when it was the ammunition plant, Verlin has all the info. So that's going to be a great lecture as well. Tony asked, will there be bison?
Yeah, and I did reply that the HoChunk Nation has had an interest in that, as well as not just the nation. A lot of people get excited by the prospect of having bison out on the Sauk Prairie. It's not going to happen anytime soon, primarily for the reason that the land can't support herd bison at this point. And so you have to restore the land before you can even think about even having a small herd for educational or cultural purposes. But I quickly want to add that you're not so far away. If you want to take an hour or 2 long ride, you can go down to a place in northern Illinois called the Nachusa Wetlands that Charlie and I know pretty well, and see a herd of bison there outside Chicago at the former Joliet Army Ammunition Plant, the sister to Badger. It's now the Medewin National Tallgrass Prairie. They have bison there. Out in Iowa at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge. So these are places where bison are being brought back into landscapes of the Midwest where they haven't been in 150, 200 years. So it's going to be a long-term effort, but it is something the HoChunk have considered and kept thinking about.
One more question before we start the next video, and you will have a chance to ask questions again after that shorter video. And that was if there's any interest in possibly moving the public lands portion towards state park or national wildlife refuge status, and what might be the pros and cons of doing so. That sounds like it could be a long answer, but Charlie did try to do a brief explanation. Go ahead, Charlie.
Well, there was a long deliberative process at the state level to declare it as a state recreation area, and I think that will stick for the duration of our lives and probably future generations, because it's a really long process through state channels to create some sort of be it a state park, a state recreation area, a wildlife area, and each one of those landscapes has different uses. The recreation area status gives more opportunity for a variety of activities out there, some of which we would prefer not be invited out there, but that's the nature of this process. It's a state recreation area, and there's great opportunity to go out there. There's hunting, there's biking, there's horse riding, there's hiking, and any number of activities out there.
Charlie, could you now, let's dive into this next video, and can you set it up for us a little bit?
I'm gonna let Kurt talk about it because he's the mastermind behind this project and behind the video. So Kurt, why don't you share with us?
Well, real fast. In fact, it's pretty self-explanatory. So I won't say too much about it, except to say this is a short video. If you can hang with us. I know we get Zoom fatigue, all of us, but this is a treat. I mean, this little gem of a film was done by actually another student of mine who had skills as a filmmaker, in addition to what he was doing his research on at the time he was a student. And he heard the story of the historic apple trees at the Badger Army Ammunition Plant, and he thought it would make a good subject for a little film as he was exploring his own talent. And his name is Anders Gerda, by the way. He now lives up in the Twin Cities, but he did this film and when he was still a master's student at the UW in Madison. And rather than explain much more about it, I think it does really explain itself pretty well. But it's a fun little side project that we took up a few years back, and it has assumed a life of its own and deserved a film of its own.
Okay, ready? To you. This interest in the apple trees and what they represent started with our friend Mike Mossman. Mike, we asked to come out here and do some surveys of the bird populations.
That first summer, after they announced that the plant would be closed, I ran my bird survey. I got permission from the Army and Dairy Forage, and we just ran transects north-south throughout all Badger. And you came across these farmsteads, and they just started becoming very intriguing and almost, ghost-like. Seeing something like the apple trees was always a sign of, life surviving and the culture and the lives of these farm families surviving in some way. So they became very sort of symbolic.
And it's a moment to pause and think about the rich history that's embedded in layers on this landscape, starting with the native presence, which of course goes back 10,000 years. But in modern times, this was land occupied by the HoChunk Nation. So the HoChunk lost their landscape here in the late 1830s in a series of treaties, leading to the creation of the farming community of Sauk Prairie. At Badger, we had a little more than 80 families out here from the 1840s on until the 1940s, for a century, until this dramatic event comes along when World War II breaks out, the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and then immediately the U.S. government said, we need to come in and have your farms to make the Badger Army Ammunition Plant.
One day, my grandmother answered the door to the knock of the postmaster, who delivered a registered letter. And when they opened the registered letter, it was on the U.S. government letterhead, and it says, you have hereby signed and accepted the $1, and there was a crisp $1 bill in it, as your down payment. And they were all kicked off their land in less than 60 days.
So this farm was one of those 80 farms. It's the Huber farmstead. And there's still some remnants even of their barn. And it did have this big old tree that we call Methuselah sitting out here in what then probably were pastures or crop fields. Just a couple things jump out at you when you see a tree like this. This is a survivor. This is a tree that has seen a lot. And it keeps on doing what trees do. It keeps growing, it keeps producing fruit, it keeps putting out its leaves and collecting sunlight and carbon in the soil and all that.
And most of the stuff was dug up pretty well out here. It's really hard to find any.
I have some notes from when I was doing the bird surveys, but mostly I was just kind of noting where the farmsteads were, marking them on a map, and then coming back and getting a look at them when I had a little more time. But it was the presence of things like apple trees that made them compelling to come back to.
And it took some time, 15 years actually, before we got serious about saying, well, let's go back and see if we can really document those trees. Then we began the process of finding these trees, tagging them with these little aluminum tags and putting little markers on them because they're a little hard to pick out. We got up to 150, 60 trees. The next step then was to see if we can select a few of the ones that we feel are either special or were representing a historic farmstead, or they were old and we feared we might lose the tree, or that really tasted really good, and see if we can conserve that genetic heritage of apple trees here at Badger. And maybe we even have something that's really special.
We may not ever find a name for some of these different apples, but there are some that I tasted today that are absolutely phenomenal apples. Those ones that just, when you bite them, it's just like, this is good.
Part of the reason we're doing this whole project is that we have lost a lot of the diversity of our apples over the last century. According to Dan Bussey, we had about 17,000 extant varieties of apples a century ago.
Most commercial orchards dispense these old varieties as so much being obsolete. But the thing is, why are we still growing them? Why are people still collecting those things? Because they have that unique combination of flavor and quality and characteristic that make them so distinctive that it would be a serious loss to not have them around. So the more you know what's out there, the more you get spoiled, as I am, that it's hard to go to a store and buy an apple because they just don't taste the same to me.
So what we did is we got the piece of scion wood that we grafted with, put it on the rootstock, and now that we have them growing out, what you see on these little signs are the number of the tree, and you also see on most of them names of the farmer and farmstead from which that tree came. So we'll be able to track back to where these trees actually came from, and that allows us to connect the tree to the farmer, to the descendants of the farmer, with the ultimate goal of creating an orchard and inviting some of the farm families and their descendants from those families to come back and actually plant the trees themselves as a way of honoring the sacrifice of those families at the outset of World War II.
This also happens to be the homestead of the Kinchy family, and when we came out here on the day of the apple transplanting event, it just so happens that the grandson of the family that owned this farm was able to transplant the first apple graft into the ground here, and that was a really important moment, I think, for this project.
I was extremely close to my grandfather, maybe even closer than I was with my own father. The day they opened the gate here that we could come in and plant the apples and I could put my hands in the dirt that he had farmed was really, really special. So this was the first apple tree that was planted, and this one was the second one, and that was planted by my son. So.
It's a painful chapter in the history of our community here. And so these trees were their legacy, and they're not here anymore. The families, however, are still in our community. They're our friends and our family and our neighbors and our in-laws, and I know a lot of these families have become friends with many of them. And so by doing this project, by taking some of these old trees, grafting them, propagating them, creating a little nursery now, and hopefully very soon in the next couple of years creating an orchard, we can reconnect in this landscape to those families who were alienated from this place. So here we are. It's a simple thing, an apple tree. Everybody knows apples, everybody loves apples. But a simple thing like that can tell a really rich story.
Thanks for sticking with us for those who are still on, and it looks like we got most of everybody. Very quick update, and if you have any questions, we can talk about this. I see your question there, Tony. I'll talk about that. Quick update. We did the film. This film was done now 2 years ago, so there's a little more news lately, and that is this last fall, for the first time, we were able to transfer trees out of the nursery. After about 2 or 3 years, they get too big and you have to get them out. So now you can see actually some of the trees that were in that nursery. We planted 7 trees behind the Sauk Prairie Hospital. Those of you know the newer hospital on the west side of town in Sauk Prairie. To the east of on the east side of their campus, they have a set of walking trails, and we were able to bring 7 trees and plant them there at the Sauk Prairie Hospital. There are 3 trees along the Sauk Trail at the new Culver Library in Sauk City. So you can see 3 trees there. And then we also, the Kinchy family, who you've now gotten to know a little bit tonight, the Kinchy family came with a little U-Haul truck and took 10 trees for their family to disperse as they see fit. So there are 10 trees among the Kinchys. So it's a wonderful thing to now be able to move these trees out. And there are some great ideas about next year. Even with COVID, we should be able to get trees out in the spring. And this is my one moment to make a pitch that we're going to need a lot of volunteers in the spring. We're going to need a lot of labor. It doesn't mean you have to do it a lot, but it means a lot of people can do a little. And we'd love to have you involved. And Becca or I can help set you up to do that. And I should also say, again, since we probably have a disproportionate number of Sauk Prairie and Sauk County people here, if you are a member of one of the old Badger families, the farm families, or you are friends with descendants of those 80 farm families at Badger, spread the word. The whole project, its first priority was to work with the families to have trees provided to the families themselves to, again, do with as they wish, to honor their own ancestors and their sacrifice at Badger. So spread the word, and we can help do that. We already have a number of friends and families who are descendants of Badger families who are very interested in having trees. And I know Lori Waffenschmidt, I saw her name on the list tonight too. The Waffenschmidt family will get some trees into their hands. So the question about groundwater and its impact on apple trees, that's actually a very interesting question that has very little research done on it. And so there's a research component here too, that the short answer is it's very, very unlikely that any contamination in the soil or water will affect the apples. What studies have been done show that deep-rooted annual or perennial things like trees don't take up chemicals the way, say, an annual leafy vegetable would at the surface of the soil. So, but again, that's a question that needs more research. And so we hope to be able to, we hoped over the last few years to be able to do this, just haven't pulled the pieces together yet, to have some research on that, because it can be really important for other people who are interested in trees, especially in urban settings. And there's more and more interested in that in even large cities. Yeah, any questions? I'm more than happy to ask or answer. Or comments.
Well, I can add a comment to what Kurt has said. When I first came to the Alliance 5 years ago, there were murmurings of these historic apples out there, and being a biologist with a focus on ecological restoration, I sort of ignored the whole apple story until Kurt and Dan Bussey, who you saw in the film, took me out there and introduced me to the apples. And all of a sudden I realized the significance of these historic apple trees out there. And when I introduced this video, when I was giving it in public just a year ago, when we were not confined to our home spaces, I would say these are the trees that survived World War II, because whereas all of those farm buildings were deconstructed right at the beginning of the war in 1942, and imagine barns and houses and fences, churches, schools, all of those buildings were completely destroyed. But what remained are historic apples, and in some cases lilacs and a few old spruces that were found along driveways and things like that. But the vegetation survived, so it's a great story. And thanks to Kurt and Mike Mossman for bringing this story to all of us and now resuscitating these very old apple trees through this grafting project. And with any luck, maybe we can do a grafting workshop in 2021, but we'll wait and see.
I was actually just on a call on that yesterday with Dan and our friend Rob Nuri, and stay tuned. Yeah, if you're interested in learning how to graft apple trees or how to prune old trees, it's a fun skill to know and learn. And we did workshops last year when we could, well, 2 years ago now. And we'll hope to do some more of that, yeah, depending on, obviously, situation come spring. So we'll see if it can work out. Did any grape plants survive? Wow, that's an interesting question. We'll have to ask Mike Mossman that one, because Mike knows these farmsteads better than anybody. There are definitely lilacs, there are definitely daylilies, there are definitely spruce trees. All these trees that you know are not either native or introduced plants that you're familiar with. You see them and you go, oh, that's the mark of an old farmstead, because they often were ornamental varieties or, again, fruit trees. So maybe, again, if things allow, Becca and I can work together to set up a field trip on apples sometime next year too, or this year too, to go out and see some of these trees in there and where they exist. And they have blinked out. I mean, part of this, you heard at the end of the film, you know, we may lose some of these trees. And in fact, several of the trees have blinked out, but they survive in the nursery. So we still have the genetic material. And so, yeah. And we got a couple more minutes. I can't resist telling one very short story. I'll make it fast. About when we were transplanting the trees this last fall. Dennis Kinchy, again, who you've seen now in these films, came out with his son to take 10 trees for their family. And I called up Allison over at Dairy Forge Center, who you also meet in these films, because she has one of her employees who's a descendant of the Steiber family. The Steiber farm was in the far northwest corner of Badger. When you go up Highway 12 and look inside to the east, just beyond the fence, that was the Steiber farm, and there are several apple trees on that farm. So he heard wind of this. He came over and he met Mr. Kinchy, and it turns out that they're cousins. And they sat there for an hour telling stories about their family, even though they hadn't seen each other in like 30 years. And we were looking at our watches and saying, we've got work to do here, guys. But then I said, no, don't cut it off. This is exactly why we were doing this project, was to help those human connections revitalize too, as much as it is the connections with the land. So that's the value of a simple little project like this, and something only the Alliance, only us funny folks in the Alliance would have thought to do, to try to build on that opportunity.
Has Dan identified any of the mystery varieties yet?
You know, we haven't got to that phase of doing this because we've been so busy with all these other parts. However, very quickly, there is one apple. It's actually on the Steiber farm, and you see him holding it in the little film. It's kind of it's the only russet apples, for those who know apples. It's the only russet that we know of on Badger, and he got so intrigued by this particular variety. This guy knows apples more than anybody in North America, literally. And he got so excited by this one apple. And to make a long story short, it's a whole nother discussion, but he thinks it goes back to a variety that was planted in Sauk County up northeast of Baraboo back in the early 1900s, because it had a distinctive taste and look to it, and he tracked it back to nurseries that were extant in Sauk County in 1920. So he thinks it's an apple that came out of Greenfield Township. We'll hopefully be able to do more on that in the future, because there are some distinctive apples out there. And And Sauk County was a center for apple work back in that 100 years ago.
Kurt, I think you kind of answered this already, but I wanted to make sure you saw that Amanda Fuller asked if there are any other interesting relics of the farmstead still there, biological or otherwise. And so you did mention some other items, but is there anything else that we didn't discuss yet?
Amanda, it's so good to see your name. Amanda was one of our early volunteer coordinators at Badger for the Alliance, and it's so great to see her. This is one nice thing about Zoom, isn't it? Amanda lives now down in Louisville. So yes, in fact, Amanda, your memory is perfect. There are, as Mike says in the film, there's not much left of these old farmsteads, but concrete foundations and sidewalks and things like that are still out there because they were tough to remove. So yeah, there is at the Henry farm that as you remembered, Amanda, that little baby's footstep captured in concrete. And that's part of what makes Badger so weird and interesting and fascinating and emotional, is to see these layers of human history all layered onto each other and to see those connections. So, yeah. I see Jonathan has a question here. Maybe Charlie, maybe you have some thoughts on this one. The link between Badger and the Vietnam War protesters. Yeah. Rented a plane in Middleton and threatened to drop a bomb on Badger, and it was a complete fiasco. But Charlie may have heard more about that story than I. But the interesting thing is a footnote to that. I think it was Carlton Armstrong, who was notorious in some circles for this incident and for being a protester in Madison during the Vietnam War. It turns out, if I remember the story correct, he had an uncle who worked at Badger and was one of the, I think it was 4 or 5 men killed in the single most tragic accident at Badger, and is buried in the cemetery along the old Highway 78 east of Badger near Merrimack. So Carlton Armstrong, whose story is again woven into the Vietnam protest era, turns out he had this very personal and tragic connection to the history of Badger through his family.
Well, thank you, Charlie, for leading into our closing this evening. Charlie just left the SaukPrairieVision.org website is in the comment section. Becca, can you put your email address in maybe one more time in case people want to get to know you more and learn more about the Alliance as well? And I just have to give my sincere thanks to my 3 guests today, Becca, Kurt, and Charlie. It is wonderful learning from you, and I hope to continue to learn from you. If you enjoyed watching this presentation, we do have 2 other lecture series, 2 other lecture events this year. And one is directly related to the Badger ammunition plant. And the other one is not about the Badger lands, but about the driftless area. So still very nature-based. So check those out so you can get more information on our website, riverartsinc.org. And I do want to give a thank you again to our sponsors today, which are the Community Foundation of South Central Wisconsin and Craig Culver. Any parting words from my panelists?
One thing, we also will be starting to host a lecture series, so keep an eye out for that if you enjoyed this. It will probably start sometime in February or March. So if you watch our website, or if you email me and ask to be put on to our email update list, you will. That would be the best way to find out about those.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Thanks, Becca.
Thank you again, Lindsay, and to my colleagues, thank you so much. And again, a shout out and welcome to Rebecca. And we wish you all the best in carrying things forward. And one last big hearty thank you to Charlie for his leadership over the last 5 years.
Thank you, Charlie.
Cheers. Thanks, everybody, and good night.
Everyone have a good night.